57 years ago, on May 26, 1965, our church bell was blessed by Father Dan Sullivan before it and the belfry were hoisted onto the roof of this church building. A few days ago, this past Thursday, exactly 57 years later to the day, on May 26, 2022, Good Shepherd's bell tolled 21 times. Once for each of the shooting victims at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, joining church bells everywhere in a nationwide ring of lament over the murder of 19 innocent children and 2 caring teachers. Earlier in the day on Thursday, our healing prayer group gathered for morning prayer in the chapel, and we prayed for the repose of each of their souls. Meanwhile, in Buffalo, the community there was still burying their dead. 10 people of color shot and killed in a grocery store by a white supremacist. It was not lost on me that Thursday was also Ascension Day, the moment when Jesus' disciples watched helplessly as he departed from them to be with the Father. They are left feeling alone, bereft of God's presence until the promised arrival of the Holy Spirit 10 days later at Pentecost. That they're not understanding his departure, their desire that he remain with them, their sense of abandonment should be at the core of our readings that day, seemed unbearable. As does the tender pleading prayer that Jesus prays in today's gospel lesson, that they may all be one. As you, Father, are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, that they may become completely one. With Jesus asking of us something that seems crucial and challenging and pretty much impossible, that we may all be one. Especially in this world where common ground seems so rare and violence so common, where people are shot in grocery stores, churches, and schools, where wars are waged simply out of lust for power, where the right to purchase a semi-automatic rifle has overtaken the right to gather for worship or to access education or simply to shop for groceries. As difficult as it may be to hear it in the context of recent events, that Jesus' high priestly prayer for unity should show up in such a central way in our lectionary readings is a powerful reminder to let the reality of where we've gotten to, of 19 children and their teachers gunned down, sink in. Let us at least be one in our grief and lament, in our holy outrage. For God did not endow us with nifty opposable thumbs so that we might use them to lock and load or pull a trigger. Our uniquely human hands are meant for reaching out and holding on to others, for lifting each other up, not shooting each other down. Setting aside for the moment the question of unity between disparate political parties and our respective stances on gun control, it's a stretch to find much, if any, common ground, even within Christianity itself. Christian unity? Hardly. We are divided in countless ways, from who may or may not receive the sacrament of Holy Communion, to marriage equality, the ordination of women, and the full inclusion of LGBTQ plus people in the common life of the Church. Or even more anciently, whether the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, or from the Father only. We'd be pretty hard-pressed to say that we are one. Sure, we sing some of the same hymns and we say some of the same words. The Nicene Creed, for example, an ancient attempt at creating unity, but we are not all on the same page. Far from it. God love all of us, but even this congregation doesn't agree on everything. It isn't that difficult to see ourselves in the old joke, how many Episcopalians does it take to screw in a light bulb? There's more than one punchline to that zinger, but one of my favorites is that it takes at least 100 of us 12 to sit on the board, which appoints the 5-person nominating and personnel committee, which in turn establishes an 8-person buildings and grounds committee, whose task it is to appoint a light bulb changing study group of no fewer than 4 people, who will then choose a qualified person to screw in the light bulb. And after the light bulb is screwed in, it takes another dozen or so individuals to complain about the method of installation and the relative dimness or brightness of the bulb, and a couple dozen more to debate the ecological impact of using a light bulb at all. We have different personalities and worldviews. We come from various cultural and social and religious backgrounds. We bring all kinds of hopes and expectations and opinions and sometimes even emotional baggage with us to church. We might not always see eye to eye. We might not always believe the same thing or worship in the same way. We might not feel like talking to each other sometimes. But our identities, who we truly are not separate, Jesus taught. We are intimately intertwined and linked. We are not meant to be independent creatures. We were created to be in relationship with God and with each other, meant to move beyond self in order to enter into a mystical union and unity with the glory that is the love between God the Father and the Son, to become one, as Jesus put it. This ancient notion of oneness and unity, that we find ourselves only by finding the sacredness of each other, went completely against the cultural norm of his day. And it still does. In our what's in it for me society, individuality and self-sufficiency are highly prized, even in the language of spirit. Even in the language of spirit, we tend to talk about finding ourselves, not finding each other. Jesus is not just asking that we simply get along here. He is not just saying that we need to feel some love toward each other. He is astonishingly praying for a union amongst us that resembles what he has with the Father. There is something so much more powerful available to us than anything we've experienced if we will lean into what Jesus is praying here. The glory that you have given me, I have given them, so that they may be one, as we are one. I in them and you in me, that they may become completely one. Yet for centuries now, we have not lived out this idea of radical unity in and with God that Jesus taught, but instead a kind of mass delusion that we are, in fact, separate from, or better than, or more important than some other member of creation. And this, as we feel so deeply this week, this comes at a catastrophic price. In 2018, after the mass shooting at Tree of Life Synagogue, in which 11 people were murdered, I joined in standing and worshiping in solidarity with a nearby congregation at their first Shabbat service following that tragedy. The time of communal prayer was particularly moving. And when I was with my Jewish siblings, a particular line stood out for me in their prayer book. As much as we are inheritors, it said, we are also transmitters. In continuing the commitment of our ancestors, we become links in a chain, passing on to children, students, another generation, that which we have received and renewed. We may have inherited a certain set of circumstances not to our liking. The question is, how will we renew these circumstances and pass them on to the next generation? How will we receive and renew this world with its culture of other-making and gun violence and transmit something else, please God, to our children and to our children's children? I suggest that we begin with lament, with being one in our communal lament, a practice and tradition that has great biblical, theological, and pastoral meaning and significance, and is so present in the raw and candid language of so many of the Psalms. a kind of mourning that is not silent but is expressed loudly, a prayer that is not passive but rather a call to action, one that participates in the arrival of the kingdom for which we so desperately long. For as N.T. Wright has said of the power of lament, when we are indwelt by the Holy Spirit, then somehow God is praying within us for the pain around us. How long, O Lord? How long? Lament is a prayer in pain that leads to trust, a kind of prayer that shakes the foundations of the very ground beneath our feet and unshackles the chains of self-sufficiency that bind our hearts and minds and sets us free. The divisions that separate us are not caused by a difference in opinion so much as a lack of relationship. Bill Blaine Wallace constructs lament as fundamentally relational, that paying close attention to one another amid life the way it really is bridges the distance between self, God, and neighbor. That consolation and solidarity rise from and reside in that space between self, God, and neighbor. And that through our communal practice of lament, God rises among us. Lament is not only for the suffering, it is for solidarity with the suffering. And so our lament is only where we begin, for it moves us to prayerful advocacy and to action, to move forward in advocating for laws that support gun safety and human flourishing for all of God's people. We become one when we allow each other's experience of suffering to become the substance of our own experience and prayer, and then act, intercede on their behalf. Isn't this, after all, what Jesus did for us?